Thank you all for joining us. My name is Erasma Beras-Monticciolo, and I am your host for Powering Up with Power of Two, in which we engage with community leaders, residents, and advocates to talk about pressing issues affecting families and children in New York City, and the steps that we can each take as individuals and as a collective to ensure the health and well-being of our communities. A couple of reminders before we begin. We will make this video accessible in Spanish, and closed captioning is available for those differently abled. We also encourage you to share your questions with us in the chat. Okay, so please remember to do that. For those of you listening in for the first time, Power of Two is a homegrown organization in New York City that partners with parents and caregivers in rebuilding confidence in their inherent parenting abilities to develop a sense of belonging and really maximize cultural pride as a way to buffer our children from the toxic stress of structural racism. We also use that as a way to tap into what comes naturally, which is responsiveness and nurturance, to heal and strengthen relationships in order to raise healthy, liberated children and support long-term community cohesion. To support these efforts, we center the lived experiences of our families, our foundational relationships, and collaborative research to, in partnership with our families, identify and co-create hyperlocal solutions that address current and historical issues that limit the healthy development of children, of our families, and communities. Today, I'm excited to welcome Daneele Thorpe, doctoral candidate at Stony Brook University, a Brownsville, Brooklyn native, woohoo, and lead researcher on the research study Ecological Predictors of Parental Beliefs about Infant Crying in a Randomized Clinical Trial of ABC. Daneele will talk with us about this groundbreaking research, the importance of demystifying research, how we can leverage our own research led by and with community to advocate for resources that would lift all of our boats. Daneele, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Fabulous. So, Daneele, I am a strong believer that the personal is political, and would like to start us off by asking you, what is your personal connection to the work that you do?
Yeah, I have a lot of personal connection to this work, not only stemming from growing up in Brooklyn, but also my origin. So I was born in Jamaica. So different contexts. We also have a lot of systemic oppression, that has been there from a history of colonialism. So for me, it was identifying those similarities between the community that I was born in and the community that I was raised in for part of my life. And part of that is really advocating for the people in these communities, my community, myself, my family, neighbors, to really give them a voice and advocate for broader change. And I think that's really the way that we're going to get forward, emphasizing that community cohesion and working together to effect real change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Can you give us a sense of, how did this evolve for you? How did you get into the research field to begin with?
Yeah, I was actually, when I was younger, I thought I wanted to be a pediatrician. So I was really fascinated with working with kids. But I think, going to college, so I was fortunate enough to be given an opportunity by the Posse Foundation. Shout out to Posse. Full tuition scholarship to Franklin and Marshall College. And that's where, I found this mentor in a professor, Dr. Penn. He was, one of the few Black professors at Franklin and Marshall. And he was also a clinical psychologist. So, integrating my love for child and working with community and working with children and wanting to embody everything that he was, so he kind of became that role model for me and showed me that here's this path where you can advocate for community, advocate for children, and affect, long-term meaningful change.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Daneele. One of the things that I know, at least for, I'm going to speak from from my experience, has been that, finding those mentoring relationships really early on in my academic career was really challenging. So I think that's really wonderful that you were able to find someone with that, commonality and deep understanding of our communities and the self to be able to inspire you to do this work. But I could imagine too that, it can be a really challenging trajectory, right, as an African American woman. So I'm wondering, can you share a little bit how you've navigated the field in your identity and with the potential intersectionalities of who you are?
Yeah, so, in my early schooling in Jamaica, everyone mostly looked the same. So it was really about, what else are you bringing to the table? Academics, extracurricular. And I think my first understanding of race and where, my positionality of being a Black woman was, being in the United States and realizing, okay, I'm different. And then having to navigate these spaces, especially in higher education, because not many people look like you.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't many people in positions of power that can advocate for you. But what I have to constantly remind myself and continue to remind myself is someone has to be that person that someone looks up to. So really wanting to change the playing field so that, someone who's 4 years old can say, okay, I want to be like that person one day, to really kind of embody what, Dr. Michael Penn was for me, for other children in the community.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have it within ourselves and within our community to model what it is that belonging looks like and what opportunity looks like, right? So thank you for sharing that. So, I want us to get into, the nitty gritty of the research study that you led. But first, I want you, if you can, to give us a summation of the study and its findings.
Yeah. So one thing that, again, is important to me is understanding how broader societal factors affect families. And a joke in academia is that the research that you do is not really research, it's me-search. So you investigate things that are important to you, that have these ties to you. So just to give you a background before summarizing the study, something that I've realized, and I have spoken to my mom recently about, is why she never let me have any friends growing up. So I was not really allowed to leave the house. And I kind of took that as, okay, she doesn't want me to have any friends. And I was raised as an only child, which made it harder. So I think more recently, probably within the last 2 years, I had a conversation with her about understanding why she did that. And I think that really motivated some of this research about, she expressed to me, well, I wanted to ensure your safety. I didn't want you to interact with the wrong crowd. I didn't want you to be exposed to community violence. So if that meant sheltering you and you didn't have any friends, that's what that meant. And I think oftentimes parents, society can stigmatize parents for behaviors like that without fully understanding the motivation behind it. So, in regards to the research that I'm doing now is really understanding how some of these broader factors, whether it's community violence or poverty, or these systems that have been, woven into the fabric of society, how they affect families and children and how parents parent. So that was the impetus behind this research. And what I found is that it does matter. These larger societal factors do affect parents. Parents don't, just say, I want to parent in this way. They have, valid motivations about why they engage in some of the practices that they do. And that was, a primary finding in this research. And, with the support of community organizations, parents can, support their own parenting, channel that the natural inclination they have for parenting and parenting their children in ways to ensure their long-term well-being, really having organizations foster that and to say, hey, you are a great parent. despite, the fact that society often says otherwise to a lot of the families that we serve and the communities that we're in.
Yeah, Daneele, obviously you're very familiar with our work, and you know that our goal is really to decolonize parenting for our families, right? To really help our families break free from the chains of the maladaptive behaviors that we learned from the times of colonization and, from the times of slavery and Jim Crow, right? And so much of what you said about your own experience about, your mom wanting to buffer you and protect you from what she saw as a violent community is a lot of still of what we see now, right? And really helping and supporting our families to think differently about, community and think differently about nurturance, right? But understanding that it's a combination, right, of these internal, biological experiences, but that the external factors also influence a lot of the behaviors that we exhibit and have exhibited as a community and as a culture. And so what's really exciting for me about this research that you've done is that, it gives us hope, right? It gives us hope that, we know what these external factors are, we know what they can do, but we also have an opportunity to change them. And I think that's incredibly powerful and groundbreaking. And, I want to just go back just a little bit for a moment and ask you, like, how did you arrive at the decision to do this research, right? How did you become the lead researcher on this?
Yeah, so, as a part of the doctoral program, one of the motivations is for your advisor. So in my case, Dr. Kristin Bernard, who's also affiliated with Power of Two, is to cultivate a researcher. So working with you to be able to formulate your own research questions. And, something that kind of got to me, I read this paper and they were using this really cool approach called geospatial analysis. So it's essentially just a fancy way of saying that, like, neighborhoods matter, and you can, find ways to look at factors within a neighborhood. So you can gather data from local police departments. You can gather data about environmental pollution, which is rampant in communities that have been historically disenfranchised. So where do they put toxic waste sites, for example? So getting into that research was what motivated me, and then learning some of these ways to investigate these questions. So, I kind of took that to Dr. Kristin Bernard and, said, how can we integrate some of this new approach that I'm learning with some of the data that we have at Power of Two to really contextualize how the context in which our families live and the context in which our families are parenting, to really, shed light into some of these broader factors. So, I started writing the paper, looking in this cool geospatial analysis, which again is really just a fancy term. It's not that it wasn't that difficult to learn. But again, just to shed light on some of these factors and really writing that up, making sure that we were framing it in a context that was supportive to parents and really shed light on the systemic changes that we need in communities. And, we eventually published it, and we really wanted to bring it back to the families that we're working with to show that, okay, you participated in this research. Here's what we found. How can we, collaborate, take this, run with it, like knock on policymakers' door? How can we contact stakeholders? What do we need to do to, make sure that this is not just, in a piece of paper? How do we turn this document into something living? How can we affect change from what we know, what we can see, to advocate for our families?
Thank you, Daneele. I know that there are a lot of folks that are watching, young people too, I'm sure, with their parents, who are really interested in understanding how this type of work is shaped, right? A couple of things. One, what are the qualifications or the credentials that are needed to become an author of a study like yourself? So that's one. But then part two to that is really understanding the methodology that you use, right? And how do you basically, what time frame were you looking at from the start to finish of the study, and how did you ensure the fidelity of the methodology of the study? So let's start off with, what are the specific credentials that are needed to actually engage in this type of work?
Yeah, so I think, once you're in college, you can, partner with professors that are doing, research that you're interested in, even high school. So you can start from early if you know that this is something that I want to do, reach out to folks whose work seem interesting. And I do acknowledge that sometimes there are barriers to that. So I didn't know what research was until college. Where I was able to access like research articles, which I think the field is, definitely making steps towards making that more accessible for folks. So it's really, partnering with professors or teachers to get involved with research, learning the steps to conducting a research study from the start to the finish. So that's how I got connected with research and have been kind of doing that since college.
Okay. And, one of the things that obviously in the space that we're in, in this moment where, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. I know that New York City is opening up, but the reality is that our communities are still, have high infection rates, right? And there are a lot of different reasons for that. There's access to barriers, there's, misinformation, but there's also, some hesitation or distrust of the research that went into the development of the vaccine, right? And that of course comes from, our long history with, the medical research field, related to Tuskegee and of course, many others. And so, how did you approach, I guess, more generally, the challenges related to our history with research, and what do you want to say to our listeners that look like us, right? That have that understanding and that historical knowledge of, the pain and the harm that past research has had on our communities. What do you want to say to folks? How do we demystify this a little bit?
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I acknowledge and something I've definitely had to grapple with going into this field with, hearing about things like the Tuskegee experiment or the studies they were doing on Puerto Rican women to develop birth control. So it's grappling with some of that history while also saying, okay, I understand that there is this history, how can I change it? And I think with part of demystifying it is to create opportunities for individuals in the community to get in touch with research, to be a part of research, to do it themselves, to have people conducting these studies that look like them. So at least it breaks down some of those barriers, like, okay, this person's part of my community. They understand some of my lived experience, again, breaking those barriers down in the field to have people doing the research that are part of the community that genuinely care about the well-being of the community. I think that's the first step that we can do, and then a lot of steps will have to follow after that.
Yeah. So when developing, the idea, so you came up with the hypothesis and you said, okay, this is what I want to fully understand. How did you integrate, that understanding, right? And that understanding of the harm that research has had in our community? How did you integrate that in making sure that your research and your approach was could break free from it, right? Could make sure that you're looking at this with a racial equity lens, and that it was infused with, participatory approach, with qualitative approach, and that was keeping in mind the importance and the significance of this finding in supporting, community.
Yeah, so, having that partnership with Power of Two definitely helped. So being a beacon in the community to support families, so that was one part of it. And then another part was, how can I keep up with that, with how I'm bridging the gap between, getting data from the New York City Police Department, which is an institution in and of itself that has perpetrated some of that bias in the community. How can I integrate these two different pieces to really ensure that, we're using this data to show that communities matter, but also maintaining that integrity to families? And something that Dr. Kristin Bernard and I talked about throughout this process was framing. So what words are we using? Making sure we don't use words like risk, because our communities aren't risky. There's nothing about our identities and our background that is risky. It's the systems that create disparities for us that are the problem. So we thought a lot about how we can frame this, especially when we're going to community leaders, right? Because some of that research gets lost along the way. It's like, how can we go into these poor communities and help these Black people? That rhetoric is harmful. So we really wanted to frame it in a way to say that there's resilience in this community, and we need change at the systemic level. And it's your responsibility to enact change at the broader level. We're doing what we can on the individual level. There are organizations in the community like Power of Two that are doing what they can, and we need your support.
Right, exactly. When examining the study and obviously reading the publication, and we, full transparency, folks, if you don't know already, we did partner on this. I want to get to, a question related to the study itself. And the question is, while there is a distinct correlation between neighborhood crime and parental beliefs on crime, the study also concludes that we don't know the exact mechanisms that lead to an increased parent-centered belief on, in a high crime neighborhood versus a reduced parent-centered belief in low crime neighborhood. Can you elaborate on the process of making, this connection?
Yeah, so, as you mentioned, it's just a connection we made. We found that there was an association between neighborhood crime and how parents view infant crying. So they may view it as something that causes distress. And what we didn't investigate is what's really causing that. And I think that's where we need to incorporate more qualitative approaches with asking parents. So that conversation that I had with my mother about, well, why did you do that? I wanted friends. I wanted to be out. Why did you do that? And to actually hear her reasoning, I myself had to step back in that moment and say, okay, my whole life I've conceptualized it as, well, you didn't want me to have friends, but having to really step back and understand the motive behind her behaviors. And I think we need to do more of that. It's easy to say that one thing is associated with another, but I think it's even more powerful to really look at why parents are engaging in these behaviors. And I think, understanding those mechanisms beyond that general association is also an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, thank you for that. So in what ways were you able to then conclude that it was high neighborhood crime that offered a distinct, I would say a distinct difference in parenting beliefs about infant crime?
Yeah, so what we actually did was, to get neighborhood crime data, all of that data is publicly available on New York City Open Data, so anyone can go to that website and access that data through the police department. So we got all those incidences of crime, crimes that were happening in the community, and looked at the amount of crime that was happening around our families' homes. And really look at, okay, so we're seeing that when there's more incidences of crime, when there's a higher police presence, families also have these beliefs about how they view infant crying. So looking at that association between, okay, how many numbers of crime are we seeing? Let's talk about police presence, and how can we relate that then to what some of the families are telling us about how they view some of their infants' behaviors.
That's terrific. Thank you. One of the things that I said early on during, our conversation is that, this study is the first of its kind, right? What does that mean to you personally and professionally?
It's a tough question. I think, there's studies that have looked at, crime more generally and have begun to apply these approaches where they're getting that data from public sources. And I think, to me, expanding that work to now looking at how, we're seeing these patterns in younger kids. So a lot of this research is focused on like older children because they have more direct contact with their community, but really expanding that to understand that some of these patterns start from very early on, to really expand the scope of our thought, to implement some community-based changes, family work with parents of younger children. So, that's what it means to me, I guess, professionally and personally. It's definitely nice to see, especially in the last year, that there's a bigger focus on how some of these community patterns and systemic patterns affect the way that, people interact and how parents parent and how children grow up in certain neighborhoods. So, and hopefully that, personally for me, hopefully seeing these broader focus on these contextual factors, we'll start to see more tangible and visible changes in the neighborhood, again, at the broader level.
Yeah, obviously, again, we have a history of research being misused, right? Or misunderstood or misinterpreted in ways that, perpetuate, a negative narrative, right? And so, one of the things that, I've been thinking a lot about is, obviously there's a big conversation, an ongoing conversation about community safety and what that looks like, and, what is violence in community and what does crime in community look like and who really perpetuates it, right? And so I'm always concerned about, okay, how do we make sure that decision makers aren't misapplying, right? Aren't incorrectly applying the learnings and the findings from this work to make a case for, stronger policing. So we have stronger policing, then there's less violence in the community, and, then parents will be able to better care, be more responsive for their children. But that doesn't necessarily, that's not what we're saying, right? So I think it's important to, as you were mentioning, to ensure that framing, right? That not only do we need to frame how we engage in the work, right, with families and community, but that we also must do the work of framing for those decision makers and those policymakers in thinking about the correct implementation of the findings, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And that's part of it. It's not only how we frame it, but also, working directly with community stakeholders, having families work directly with community stakeholders. That way, it's not a top-down process. I'm implementing something for your community because I think it works. Really getting the voices of folks in the community to say, okay, this is what we want. This is what we don't want. This is what, policies like stop and frisk that were implemented as a result of, communities being higher violence. We learned that doesn't work, and there were a lot of biases in those policies. So really having community members tell you, okay, this is what we want, and this is how we think you can address this concern that we have in our neighborhood.
Yes, exactly. One of the other things that I've been thinking a lot about relates to, some of the, I don't want to call them barriers, but there are some difficulties, right, with the integration of, academia and research with the community perspective, right? And not to toot our own horn, but I have to, right? As an organization, we've been able to do that well, right? Integrating all of those different perspectives, right? Centering the community and family, bringing in, academia and research to really find hyperlocal solutions to the policies that are really causing us harm. And so, if you can you talk a little bit about, one, what are those barriers that currently exist, right? And I think we started talking a little bit about them when we talk about, the historical, challenges with research, but what are the existing challenges in academia that prevent them from really partnering more concretely with community and families?
Yeah, I definitely think it's historically been an issue with academia. I'm not sure. Recently, there have been Twitter threads about the ivory tower, which they refer to as academia, because it seems like it's in its own league, and then there's everything else. And I think that's not the case. Especially with getting our data from families and getting that information from families, it's really about how we can share that back. And I definitely think Power of Two as an organization and their collaboration with Stony Brook, have begun to do some of that work. So it's how can we use what we've been doing and what others have begun to pioneer to make this more the norm than an exception, because I think right now it's probably more of an exception than what's normal. So really emphasizing that and providing a framework for them, because part of it could be that they just don't know how. So how can we kind of provide a structure for them to follow to share some of that information back with the community, partnering with community, and not only stopping there, but then advocating with members of the community to, again, enforce some of these changes. Because I also think that's another piece of the puzzle, right? Policymakers, research can be difficult to understand. And I think that is the same for policymakers too. They can't digest the research. It's hard, too many words, it's too long. How can we break that barrier down too, so that policymakers really understand what researchers are finding, and then working together with the community to say, this is what we're finding, and these are the changes that we think, need to be implemented.
Yes, thank you. Let me ask something. Do you feel that having, a connection to the basis of the research gives you, as a researcher, some additional insights that others might not have?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's what drove me into this research. It's what continuously motivates my research. Research as a process can definitely be tough sometimes. So that's the thing that keeps me going, really understanding why I'm doing this work and acknowledging that it's beyond me. So if I'm having a bad day, change still needs to be implemented in the community. So how can I, keep going to be a source of that change? And I think it also provides that added perspective of, well, here's why parents do what they do. And here's my story of, when I asked my mom why she did what she did. So really understanding some of those basic stories, hearing from your parents and families and neighbors, really sheds perspective on some of the work that I'm doing.
Right, exactly. And I'm trying to, think about what are the other ways that we could potentially infuse this collaborative, approach to ensure that, because at the end of the day, it's like we need the varied perspectives, right? We need to fully understand all of the possible opportunities that exist in the world, right? And there's a level of access that I think academia has, that sometimes, those of us in the communities don't have, right? But it's the melding of that thinking and those perspectives that could really potentially lead to some powerful change, right? And there's excitement and there's hope and there's opportunity in all of that. So I have another question for you. and it goes back to, the importance and the significance of continuing this type of research. Do you feel that it's critical to continue to do research in, how the lived environments and realities of historically under-researched groups affect marginalized communities?
I definitely think that there needs to be continued work. And, there has been work done in the past. And I think some of that work has, begun with a tainted frame of mind, a biased frame of mind. So it's not that we don't have a lot of research showing some of these lived perspectives. It's that some of that research is tainted. So I think we need more research with the proper framing, doing more collaborative work, working with community organizations, and really empowering individuals in the community to be conducting that research. So being on the other side of things and not just feeling like someone is exploiting your information or, exploiting your data. I think we need more of that. So I don't think we don't have enough research. I think we need more research with that frame of mind.
Okay, thank you. So we're getting some questions here. Forgive the noise of the passing helicopter. So here's a question from audience member. What are you still interested in terms of parenting and environmental factors?
That's a difficult question. I think everything. I know that's not a specific enough answer, but really understanding other factors too. So beyond community crime, things like environmental pollution. And it sounds like, wow, this is a huge thing. But if we think about or look around in our communities and seeing where like toxic waste sites are, looking at the distribution of like garbage and where they're putting certain things and lead in the walls and the paint that they're using and how our neighborhoods were constructed, because they weren't built that way by accident. They were built that way with a purpose. So, really understanding how the ways that they've built our communities in certain ways, continue to affect different aspects of parenting. So the disciplinary methods parents use, how parents interact with their children, and so on. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, one of the things that has also really activated our community, in Brownsville and Williamsburg and Greenpoint, is the North Brooklyn pipeline. So there's this pipeline, as you know, that has been constructed right underneath, our homes, right? And there's a lot of, fracked gas that's happening, right? And the community has been mobilizing and activated to fight against this, right? Because it can have really long-term effects. But one of the things that we hear, right, from those that want to move forward is that, oh, well, there isn't enough study to show that this would, have a negative effect. It's like, well, that's not possible, right? And so not understanding not only just the health component of it, right, and the detrimental impact that it can have on community health, but also community socialization, right, that it could have on parenting, that it can have on, the social fabric, like all of these things. Climate change really affects our ability to connect, but also it affects our ability to parent, right? We parent differently, when there's extreme heat, extreme cold, right? We see this in the data, in the citywide data, that, there tends to be flared, heightened, I guess, degrees of temper when, there's high rates of heat in communities, right? So all of these things have an influence on our temperament, right? And so it's so important to research this, to understand it, and to be able to share back with community to make informed decisions about what are the specific resources that we need in order to address these potential factors that can negatively impact our ability to care for ourselves, our children, and more collectively, our community.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's see, there's some other questions here. Did any of your results or findings surprise you?
Um, I think one part of the findings of this particular study was the power of ABC regardless of the communities that families are in. So even if a family was in a higher crime community versus a lower crime community, ABC still had that powerful effect on parents. So I think that was not necessarily a surprising finding, but something that we can really, capitalize upon, right? To show policymakers that no, we're not just going to neglect communities that look a certain way or communities that, have a certain level of poverty, but this is something that can be implemented everywhere. Parents sometimes, regardless of their background, would love that additional support to have someone say like, wow, you're doing fantastic. Is powerful. So, I think that was a really powerful finding that I think we can really use to further disseminate some of the work that we're doing.
That's right. It's so for those that are new listeners to the Powering Up with Power of Two, ABC that Daneele's referring to is the attachment and behavioral catch-up model that we implemented Power of Two as part of our programming and our way of helping parents develop responsive approaches to caring for their children, because we know that has really positive long-term impacts on their health, on their well-being, on their ability to succeed academically, and of course later on in life. Daneele, what is next for you? What is next in terms of some of the research that you're currently thinking about?
Yeah, so right now I'm continuing to work on a couple different research projects and continuing to partner with different professors. So for example, I'm working with Dr. Ijoma Opara, and she's doing some of this work in Paterson, New Jersey, which is also one of those communities that, has been historically disenfranchised and has been neglected in a lot of the focus and reallocation of resources. So we're doing some of that work with understanding how communities affect youth. So these are kind of older kids, but how it affects their academic outcome. And we've actually started to meet with folks from the New Jersey Department of Education and starting to write policy reports to really get some of this idea across that we have to do something at the community level. The onus of responsibility cannot just be on kids and parents and families. They're just a small part of this larger system.
That's wonderful and truly exciting. I realize that we have a few more minutes left, and I just want to give you an opportunity to share, what is your call to action for our listeners, or, what are your parting thoughts?
I think the biggest call to action right now is to, continue to come together, share back some of this research, and really collaboratively decide how can we take this to the next level. Who are the folks in the community we need to contact? Who are the folks at the policy level we need to contact? Really mobilize. If we all need to sit down and just call their phones until somebody answers, send some letters until somebody opens one of them, that's what we need to do to really, again, get that change at the community level. If not for our generation, then definitely the ones after us.
So Daneele, you are essentially a researcher, and you're also an activist, and I'm here for it. I'm loving it. So Daneele, thank you so much for joining us today, and for really modeling for us, what community can achieve together. To all of you that are watching right now and listening, I hope that you take some time to read this really groundbreaking study. As Daneele shared, there's so much that can be gleaned from it, and so much opportunity for learning and for really shifting the narrative in our communities. To all of you also watching, I want to leave you with a quote from Zora Neale Hurston. Zora was an African American anthropologist and writer, and she was known for her research for her writing on slavery, on race, on folklore, and the African American experience. And one of the things that she said that always sticks with me after reading some of her writing is that research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. And as you heard today, Daneele has a purpose. We have a purpose. However, it must be centered around justice. It must be centered around equity, and it must be inclusive and attuned to the multiple identities associated with race, with gender, and class in our communities. And it must be collaborative. So with that, I leave you all. Daneele, thank you. Everyone, be safe, be well, stay healthy, and take care. See you next time.